Okay, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, wherever in the world you may be. And welcome to today's webinar, Best Practices to Guarantee a Successful Security Audit. And we are super excited about today's conversation and look forward to sharing best practices on how to not only build and operationalize your security program, but leverage processes to guarantee a successful audit. My name is Yehuda Kagan, and I'm excited to be hosting today's session. Before we introduce our experts, there are a few housekeeping items. To make sure our presenters provide all the great details you're looking for today, all attendees will be muted during the presentation. But in the meantime, we welcome you and your questions and comments using the webinar chat feature. And at the end of the presentation, we'll present these questions live in a live questions and answer session with our subject matter experts. And finally, this webinar will be recorded and emailed to you as a reference to share with other members of your organization. And now we'll introduce our today's speakers. Grant Elliott is the CEO and co-founder of Ostendio. He is a thought leader in enterprise cybersecurity and speaks regularly about how organizations can implement effective cybersecurity and risk management programs. Grant is also the former COO and CISO of Axiva and has over 15 years of experience developing and managing cybersecurity programs and supporting regulatory audits. Good morning, Grant.
Good morning. I just realized I probably need to update my bio. I think it's close to 20 years now.
Yeah, I was thinking that myself. All right, great. Joining Grant today is Gila Pyke, and Gila is the Ostendio's Senior Director of Professional Services. Gila brings over 20 years of experience in leading privacy and security compliance teams here at her role at Ostendio, and she is a leader with a proven record of IT governance, standards adoption, and compliance and certification testing programs around the globe. Good morning, Gila.
Good morning.
So there's been quite a bit of excitement around this topic, and so without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Grant.
Thank you, Yehuda. So, Gila, welcome to the first in our discussion series. For those listening, the great news is you can switch off your webcam and just listening away. We're not going to be doing any slides. It's just going to be a friendly chat between my friend Gila here and talking about how you go about passing a security audit. I'm going to start, Gila. Do you remember when we first met?
Yes.
Right.
I had no idea what I was in for. Yeah, it was like my third day with the high trust unit at Drummond Group. And I was informed that we had this new partner we were going to work with.
Do you remember what was kind of unique about that interaction? faint surprise. So this was during COVID, and we were all getting comfortable with this whole concept of doing these webinars together. And I always remember being super impressed because you had a couple of added participants to the Zoom meeting, if I remember, on either side of you.
Oh, did my kids show up to that?
We had this
That's
great
right.
conversation. So this is the first time I've met Gila. We're talking about, as a new partner, we're talking about you know how we basically get introduced and how we work together. And Gila's got her two daughters sitting on either side of her. And it wasn't just that they were there, they were basically making faces at everything that Gila said, right? Adding their own sort of non-verbal commentary to the whole conversation, which I absolutely loved, because to me, that said more about you than anything you could have said in that conversation in terms of your individual values, your participation, collaboration, etc. And I knew right then we were going to get on famously.
I'm really glad they're at school today.
Exactly. Well, look, tonight Yehuda gave you a little bit of your background, but I'm kind of really curious, Gila. First of all, for people that don't know, you're a little bit north of us. You were kind of north of the border up in Canada, which is not the only reason that makes you super friendly. But how did you get into this whole space of kind of cybersecurity, compliance, audits, etc.?
Oh gosh. I studied software engineering and realized that I found software development really, really boring, but I found the security side and all of the things that could go wrong during software development really fascinating. And it was really fun to go in and break stuff and see what happened when we could cause buffer overflows. And, it was the 90s, so it was the Wild West, and everybody was really excited. And we decided to form a white hat ethical hacker group and start exploring how we could demonstrate other people's security holes to them and help them be more compliant and more safe.
Now, are hackers more friendly up in Canada?
Not even a little bit. I think that was definitely a factor of of realizing that nobody listened to us when we were mean. So in order for people to listen to the really important things we wanted to say, we had to learn to be cheerful about it. That was training for sure.
Now, at a certain point, you decided to swap sides and move from the kind of building things to the kind of audit side. How did that transition happen? What made you kind of decide that maybe actually I'm going to enjoy more figuring out whether people are implementing the right level of controls rather than building them?
That's a really great question. I have this list of questions that I was prepared to answer, and you're not asking any of them, but that's fine. So I've been working in standards and security since the 90s, because in order to really be able to plan security, you need to look at the frameworks and standards that are out there. And I got to go to a couple of connectathons and standards events and test software and see whether or not the software could actually implement these standards that we were writing in our ivory towers. Because the theories were perfect, but when we sat down with the developers to understand that they were harder to implement than we thought they were, that was super interesting. But then I ended up working on a lot of government projects here in Canada, where we were buying the software that I had tested at these connectathons. And, we had really small public budgets, and we would buy the software and we'd say, well, we saw it working. We saw the audit logging controls working. We saw all of these encryption features working live at these events. So that's part of the budget. That's part of the software that we bought. And then we'd buy the software and get dinged with, 20% of our budget in custom coding to get the thing that we saw at the event working. And that's when we realized what we were seeing at these events was maybe not part of the main product stack. It was maybe just demo stuff. And all of a sudden, the notion of certifying products to actually do for real what we were expecting them to do became really important. So the idea of officially tying functionality to a product and a version, so that when you buy a product, you have some kind of assurance that it really does what it says it does, became really important.
Now, it's interesting because obviously that was at a time where people were historically buying products that they would install on their network. So people bought physical products, right? And in those days, there was the opportunity to provide different types of protections. You could provide sort of castle moat type protections. I'm kind of curious, and I know I'm kind of jumping a little bit ahead a little bit, but in today's cloud-based environment, right, where more and more organizations are using cloud-based vendors to provide services, what's your kind of thoughts around that kind of need for testing now?
Let me back into that, because that's a big question. So what we're seeing in the industry right now is that there's a lot more compromises and there's a lot more accidental incidents happening as a result of a third party either doing something or not doing something that we weren't expecting. And the reason for that is, in this new cloud space, there's so many third parties. There's the cloud provider that we're relying on, and then there's all the other subcontractors that they work with. And so having some kind of assurance, or at least ability to document and understand who's doing what, and in the event of an incident, do we even know who's involved and who to call and who provided that functionality, gets really complicated, because a lot of the time we don't even know these people exist. So it just gets more complicated to try to keep track of who is involved in securing your data. We know that they have a lot more opportunity to control security and to roll out tools, but understanding who's involved and how we interact with them has gotten a little bit more fluid.
Yeah, and I think SolarWinds definitely kind of raised that issue for a lot of people, because
Mm-hmm.
I didn't even know who SolarWinds was, right? And prior to that breach, and suddenly now everyone does. I had the fortune to listen to an interview with the incident response team for SolarWinds through an investment event I was at. And it was really interesting to hear their story, because they themselves didn't really even appreciate the kind of impact that they had. You know, as an organization, they didn't realize how critical to the supply chain they were until the event happened, and it kind of woke them up as well from an incident response. Going back a bit to you know, the kind of early days of audit, what were the kind of initial type of audit you were doing? Obviously, a lot of people focus on things like SOC 2 today, but that didn't even exist until a few years ago. So what audits did you start out doing?
I guess one of the earliest standards that was available to audit against was ISO 27001. But you know, back in 2003, it was very, very high level management audit, and so you had to walk away satisfied that an organization had somebody who was in charge of security and that they'd learned how to spell the words correctly and written it down. But that was the first time that we had a framework. And actually, even in Canada, we started using the NIST framework pretty early on, because that was the first time that there was a technical framework available for us to audit against.
It's interesting. ISO is one that I was more familiar with because of my British background. When I worked in the UK, BSI and British Standards Institute was really the kind of the founder of a lot of those kind of standards. And then, you know, as the UK joined the EU, ISO kind of came out of that as well. It was interesting because you know, when I was a former CISO and I was kind of going through the audits, you know, a lot of the European organizations were definitely driving organizations to go through ISO. But I'd speak to a lot of organizations here that didn't really know that what ISO was, unless they had, you know, operations overseas. Do you think it was more prominent in Canada because of the kind of British connection, or do you think it was just more of a kind of North American thing?
So when we learned about ISO, we learned it as BS 2799, which was the original British standard number. So maybe that's why. I think it was just the first thing that we could get our hands on that was readily available to everybody and that could be trusted by, you know, government things, because there's lots of skunkwork standards out there. But like the Zachman framework's been around forever, but only ever government talked about it. And if you try to talk to private sector about Zachman framework, they'd tell you to get out of your ivory tower and stop bothering them with things they didn't have time for.
Well, essentially, I think for me, the vacuum started to get filled, as you know, in the US by SAS 70, right? I mean, AICPA, for those who don't know, were doing a lot of financial audits, and then started to, as part of their financial audits, apply financial values to critical infrastructure. And so companies were trying to get audited based on the value of the critical infrastructure failing more of a financial control. Then people started to use that, especially as we started to move into major data centers. And so these data centers had significant financial assets in terms of their kind of their computing infrastructure. And so then now the data centers started using SAS 70 as a control, and that's obviously evolved into SOC 2. When was the first time you came across SOC 2 as a control? You started doing SOC 2. Were you doing SAS 70 before that, or did you go straight into SOC 2 when that came out?
I don't think I really heard about SAS 70 until Sarbanes-Oxley, and we started to see a couple of those scandals impact us on the buyer side. SOC 2 was definitely a welcome formalization of those. For sure, we do SOC 2 in Canada as well, but it's actually based on the ISO controls and not on the ICPA controls. So we use it a lot now, but we didn't really start using it as early as you did in the US.
Now, you started doing some work, if I remember rightly, in healthcare as well. And so you clearly came across HIPAA in the US and PIPA in Canada. tell us a little bit of your experience with that, because HIPAA in the US is an interesting regulation that people use this term HIPAA compliance a lot without really understanding that, technically speaking, there is no such thing as HIPAA compliance. How did you get introduced to that, and how did that doing HIPAA audits as opposed to maybe a more traditional ISO 27001 audit, how did those compare?
I think it was just a natural evolution of risk management in healthcare. So the wonderful thing about healthcare is that the data that we're trying to protect has a very human purpose. And so the way that we look at confidentiality, integrity, and availability is different than the financial sector and the nuclear sector, where a lot of risk management practices came from. So in healthcare, a lot of the time we want things to fail open instead of fail closed. Like if the patient data disappears at the wrong time, that's almost worse than somebody finding out that somebody has test results. So the way that we approach those risks and assess those risks started to change. And the advent of a lot of digitization of that data meant that people were starting to worry about privacy in addition to security. And all of a sudden we started to see HIPAA pop up, PHIPAA in Ontario. PIPEDA was a commercial sector privacy regulation that we started to apply to various health sector provinces. And so being able to use a regulatory framework to encourage people to pay attention to these requirements when they were maybe a little bit too busy taking care of patients and worrying about being able to see the data, then worrying about the security of the data was really helpful. So we started doing HIPAA compliance as part of just normal risk assessment. It wasn't even an audit. The minute HIPAA came out, it helped us be able to plan security and privacy directly into healthcare projects, because if you didn't, you had a regulatory risk. The wonderful thing that happened is when hospitals realized we can reduce our risk and we can control a lot of our risk and we can reduce our breaches by trying to be HIPAA compliant, meant that they were trying to force everybody to be HIPAA compliant. And that was awesome. But the fact that you can't certify to HIPAA started to become a challenge. So that's where, because you can't really do a HIPAA audit. You can do a compliance review, but
it's amazing. I used to go to HIMSS every year and see all these big claims for HIPAA compliance all over the course. And we used to have this joke internally. We'd say that you can tell how mature an organization is depending whether they use the term HIPAA compliance or not, right? If they're using the term HIPAA compliance, they're really not that mature. Look, I'm going to go into HIPAA towards high trust in a second, but
okay.
How many audits do you think you've actually completed over the last few years?
Oh man, like if we're counting interoperability standards, probably over 500 at this point. Like so audits, yeah.
What is the value to an organization getting audited per se? I mean, if I'm running my own business and I think I've got pretty decent controls in place, why do I need to go through the exercise of having an independent third-party audit? Isn't that just really an extra layer of bureaucracy? Isn't that just really just extra cost that I don't need to invest in? Because I mean, trust my engineers, they tell me that I'm secure.
I can read the white paper that I wrote 75 times and not see a typo. I'm just too familiar with it. So having somebody else proofread it for me will always identify something that I can improve. And it's the same idea, having somebody else come in and take a look at your controls from an outsider perspective, maybe take a look at it from some current events that you haven't heard about. It never hurts. Most organizations doing third-party audits understand how to present the data so that it's actionable, and it always gives you stuff that you can work on in that copious downtime that you get in between your day job.
I hear a lot of people talking about compliance, and again, when we start getting into some of my pet peeves, is one of them is this concept of compliance almost as this kind of thing on its own, right? And I've always believed that compliance is about making sure that you are compliant to a particular standard, the regulation, and obviously when it comes to security and risk management, you're trying to obviously the primary objective is kind of security and reducing risk, not being compliant. However, do you see that evolving over time? Do you see people being more attuned to that kind of mindset, or are you still seeing a kind of large degree of people kind of looking for this check the box compliance?
I think you're going to see both forever. So check the box compliance is always going to be needed in order to level set the conversation when you're talking to third parties or potential customers. There's really no way for them to understand that you take security seriously in one conversation. And so having that checklist or having that audit report helps just cross off all the boxes so that you can decide to have a second conversation. And then on top of that, there's actual real value to making sure that you have controls implemented. So there's always going to be a little bit of bureaucracy, but that bureaucracy helps manage relationships and conversations. If there's value to it.
But I see lots of promotion going on right now with organizations in the market offering 2-week SOC 2s or automating your compliance program, and sign up with us and we just do everything automatically for you. Don't worry about it. Is that, why should an organization go through a more robust security process? Why shouldn't they sign up with those kind of easy to do check the box solutions if their ultimate objective is just to be able to say that they're doing the right things? Why would that not be the right thing for an organization to do?
So you're not going to like my answer, but I think that there's value to automated, quick, check in the box approaches as well as robust approaches. And I think it really depends on your size and what you do as a business and who your customers are and what they're looking for. So my mom was a physician and she had a doctor's office with 2 other doctors, and they had 3 computers in the building. And I tried lots of times to help her build good security in her doctor's office. And, it was having somebody come in and automate and make sure that antivirus was turned on all the machines was all that she needed. So I think that there is value to having these automated turn on your logs and turn on your antivirus for you solutions. But I think that if you're doing any kind of comprehensive data management or data sharing with HIEs or other organizations, or if you're doing data analysis, any situation where you have a data lake or where you're sending thousands of results back from the lab to various doctors' offices and repositories, you need to start to look at, do I know what all my data flows are? Do I know what all of my data sources are? Do I know that I've turned on logging for all of them? Do I know that everything's encrypted and that somebody didn't turn off encryption because it slowed down processing time? So at some point, the minute that you have, more than 1,000 patients involved, you need to start to look at really comprehensive risk assessment, because for nothing else, a breach can cost you millions of dollars. So spending a few $1,000s on doing something a little bit more robust starts to become really worthwhile.
I think that's a kind of good point, because it's funny, I speak to a lot of startups all the time, and they'll ask me exactly the same question: is how much money should they invest in building their security program, going through audits? And to be honest, for most of the small organizations out there, right, it comes down to kind of this whole first order survival level, right? What's your biggest risk today? Is it going to be that you have some form of data breach, or you fail an audit, or is it going to be that you can't sign a new customer? And at the end of the day, if you're an organization is maybe less than $1 million in revenue, you're more interested in getting the next customer, and it'd be kind of remiss of us to try and persuade an organization like that to invest a significant amount of money in information security. But to that end, when is the right time, right? You mentioned, in healthcare, maybe it's 1,000 patients or whatever, but when does an organization know, right, that, hey, listen, just putting the basics in place, putting decent IT controls in place, isn't sufficient enough? When do they know that, so look, I probably at this point need to pick a framework or pick a standard and start building towards it? I at this point need to probably start considering going through some form of formal risk management program and third-party audit. When does an organization know when's the right time to start taking that seriously?
Honestly, I would say as soon as you have live individual data that you are responsible for protecting, you need to pick a framework and at least do a self-assessment or a readiness audit against it, like a gap analysis. So in the old days, you started with a framework right away and you did everything the long, slow way. I think that in these days, you build your infrastructure, you build in sort of common security controls and best practices based on what the industry tools offer you. But the minute that you have live data on the horizon for you, you should do a gap analysis against a framework and just make sure that you didn't miss anything, because it'll cost you much less time to fix it before the data's in there than it will to fix it later, or than it will to fix it after you've had a breach and everybody's watching your every move to make sure that you do it right.
And it's interesting, it's such a basic concept that I find that people don't quite get straight away, which is this idea of picking a standard and measuring it, right? I use a lot of running analogies and when I talk about cybersecurity. And my son, he's a 400 meters runner, right? And whenever I tell people my son runs at high school, the first question they go, oh yeah, really? What distance does he run, right? Because that's the standard, right? You can't tell whether someone's a good runner or not unless you can basically measure against something. And so he's running 400 meters, that's the measurement, and you measure time against that. But when I talk to people about information security and ask them, how good is your security program? They'll go, oh, it's pretty good. Right. And this concept of being able to measure, we do this exercise when we bring on new customers sometimes, and we ask them, if they're maybe talking to us about going through Assault 2, or they're talking to us going through High Trust or some sort of other framework, and we'll ask them, well, how far, how ready do you think you are to go through that audit process? And they will invariably tell us about 85%. And by the time we've done this gap analysis that you said against whatever standard, we often find they're closer to 15, 20%. And part of the reason for that from our perspective is because they confuse IT controls with information security controls. They think that because they're pretty decent, and most of the customers we do are tech companies, and so they're probably pretty good tech controls, good technology in place. They're doing a lot of stuff in the cloud through AWS or Amazon, and so there's a good security suite there. But they confuse the concept of technical controls with administrative controls. And that's a big part of the audit process. So from a customer's perspective, if you were to advise a client right now who says, hey, listen, I am going to pick a framework. I think we have good technical controls. What framework should I pick? And how long do you think it's going to take me to get ready to measure myself against that framework? How would you normally advise them?
It really depends on what their customers want, to be honest. So if a lot of the time in the US space, if you have a hospital or a payer as a customer, they will dictate to you in the RFP, you have to have this report, or we're not going to pay you, or we're not going to sign with you, or something like that. So a lot of the time, the bottom line is, if you're trying to work with United Health Group or Humana, you have to do some flavor of high trust. Sometimes they, if the service that you're providing to them isn't as PHI related, they'll take a step back and let you do a SOC 2. But the first thing that you need to look at is look at your agreements that you've signed and see what framework they require you to do. And then if you're one of the lucky ones where you've been offered an option to do ISO, SOC 2, or high trust, I think that you take a look at what you have time to do. So an ISO certification is probably the quickest and the easiest. It'll take you about a month to do the gap analysis, maybe 3 or 4 months to do the writing required to meet up with that standard. And then, finishing that audit is probably another month there. So you're done inside of 6 months. SOC 2 is probably 6 to 9 months, because it does have a lot of evidence to pull for technical controls. And if you have good technical controls, then a SOC 2 will be a good way to show that you're operating those technical controls effectively, and to have somebody from a third party to attest to the fact that you've done that. But ultimately, if you're going to be in the healthcare space, at some point, someone's going to ask you to do high trust. And with the new I1 high trust that came out, a lot of organizations that were allowing SOC 2 are now starting to backtrack and say, well, if you're not going to do the big high trust, you need to at least do the high trust I1. So I'm a big fan of high trust, so I'm super biased here, but I think that eventually you do need to be prepared to be doing high trust, if not in the next 2 years, then maybe 3 years down the road.
So you mentioned I1, right? And maybe, I don't know if everyone listening kind of knows what I1 is. High trust obviously is a big lift for a lot of organizations. And often we find from our perspective, our clients are more likely to only go through that if they're doing business with a payer or a large organization that demands it. One of the things we found is that, there can be a little bit of panic when a client has that, but invariably there's multiple ways for them to basically buy themselves time. You mentioned one, which is maybe do I1, which is a slightly lighter lift, and I'll ask you to expand on that a little bit more. But also, because of the timeline it takes to go through something like high trust, normally in my experience, you can negotiate with your customer when you have to have your high trust certification. Is that the case? So like if someone basically is working with a client right now, or they're trying to do a response to a customer that is requiring to be high trust, normally in my experience, they can negotiate and say, well, we'll be high trust in 12 months, 18 months, 24 months. And then now we've obviously got this new option that high trust have just announced called the I1. Do you want to explain a little bit more about that?
Sure. Yeah. And there's actually, I would say there's 3 steps to high trust, not just the I1 or the R2. So if you are brand new to the space and you're working with an organization that's telling you that you have to do high trust eventually, usually they will allow you to do a high trust readiness assessment the first year. So high trust readiness assessment is usually something that you do by yourself. Obviously, there's consultants out there who can help you do that to make sure that you understand what you're doing, but it doesn't result in a certification. It just results in you being able to confidently say, I looked at all the 300 controls that are required in the base high trust assessment, and here's where I think I am in those, and now I have a roadmap to getting there. So any organization that's never looked at high trust versus an organization that's at least done a readiness assessment, that's already a huge jump in understanding of frameworks, of accountability, of how much is out there to do in terms of implementing a robust security program for both technical and also administrative and physical controls. So the readiness, I would say, is the first step, and you can spend 6 months working on that. The I1 it's brand new. It's super cool. I'm really impressed that high trust has been kind of listening to the community and to some of the challenges that organizations have been trying to get high trust have had. And basically there's no scoping, there's no policies and procedures. It's just 219 controls that everybody is held accountable to. So when you get a report for an I1, you know exactly what that person's been certified to. There's no depending on what their scope, they did or didn't have controls in place. And they're just testing whether those controls have been implemented consistently across the board. So those 219 controls are also a little bit more modern than the old high trust controls. So there's a little bit more technical stuff in there, and there's less.
To define your hospital beds.
Yeah. And there's less like temporary passwords because nobody uses those anymore. But there's more SSO as a result.
Okay.
So it's pretty cool. But it's only good for a year. So you have to redo the I1 every year, which means that you kind of have to have a dedicated compliance team. The high trust R2 is the really big one, where you have to do all your policies and procedures have to be super, super detailed and super ready to go. You have to have all of your controls in place, depending on how much data you have. So if you have more than 10 million patient records, you're looking at twice as many controls as the I1. You could have over 500 of them, or actually the biggest one I've ever seen had 63 controls, which was just it's massive. It's massive to try to document and provide evidence for those, let alone implement them. So, and R2 is more work, but because you've done all of that work and because your program is so well documented and mature, it's good for 2 years. And so you get to like take a breather, operate your program for those 2 years before you have to start up all over again.
So you get your email from a potential customer, right, who basically says, hey, Gila, I've been referred to you because, I've just been told by one of my customers we need to go through HITRUST. We're already HIPAA compliant, spelled HIPPO, and we have our $10,000 budget assigned. How would you recommend we proceed?
Wow.
There's a lot in that question.
There is. So, I think it's really common to misspell HIPAA. I don't think it's a sign that you're in trouble, but I think it is a sign that we probably have some education to do. I think a $10,000 budget is very small because paying for HITRUST itself costs more than that. But if that's where you are, then the first thing that you do is you do a readiness assessment and stop there. Do your readiness assessment, understand what's left, spend a little bit of that money on your HITRUST fees to be able to get a copy of the controls that apply to you. And then once you've done that, take a look at how many gaps you have and then have a serious discussion about budget and timeline and what it's going to take to actually get certified and close those gaps.
Now, I mean a lot of flippant there because what we see a lot is we do see a lot of organizations going straight through to the assessor, whether it be HITRUST or, SOC 2 and going to the auditor. When is it appropriate for an organization? They've already determined what framework, maybe the customer dictated that. When should they be approaching an auditor or an assessor to complete the process?
So it really depends on the audit firm. A lot of the audit firms that we work with have enough experience to understand that it's a long road, and they are happy to engage with you early to help you set your scope and to help you understand what it's going to take to pass the audit. And then they give you the time to do the work. So just because you're planning to do HITRUST and talking to an auditor doesn't mean that you're going to be doing your audit in 3 months. It means that you're learning how to spell HITRUST and you're learning how to think about HITRUST and you're learning how to do everything from a detailed perspective. You're probably a year and a half out from starting the audit, but having the relationship with the auditor is great because you can ask them questions like, when HITRUST says that you're supposed to enable data sharing by having better access controls, what does that mean? And they can show you, and they can explain to you, well, this is how we've seen organizations like you address that control. So I think you should engage with them early, but don't expect to be done early.
Now, I know that AICP has a language, and for those listening, AICP is the kind of governing body for SOC.
SOC 2.
They have some language around separation of duties between sort of like, conducting the audit as an impartiality concept. Can you spend a little bit of time on that? And is that something that we see broadly across the kind of audit universe, or is it a little bit kind of mixed?
I think you see it everywhere. I think that every audit program out there, at least since 2010, if not 2005, has introduced a requirement for impartiality for their auditors, including like the 17065 accreditations for test labs and things. So, and that governs FCC security audits and things too. So most auditors will have people whose job it is to tell you that you're on the right track and to give you advice as you prepare for your audit. But those are not the same people. There's like a firewall between them and the people who are actually going to be looking at your evidence. So whoever it is that's going to be looking at your evidence and testing you needs to be independent and impartial so that whatever report or certification you end up with is trustworthy. So most auditors do that in most programs.
Where's the best place then to go and get advisory services then? I mean, if you said we already know that if you're not experienced with going through an audit, You know, it may be a framework that you're unfamiliar with, or maybe even you've spent some time internally doing some gap analysis. What's the best way to try and get some independent advice and support?
So I feel like you're asking me to say, come to us, because we absolutely do that.
There's other organizations apart from us, but yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I think that there's different participants and there's different needs. If you are an organization that you are super good at your day job, but your security team is just a couple of people and you don't really understand how to turn on all of the switches in your Azure or your AWS environment, there are providers out there who will help you deploy your controls. So MSP type organizations, and we partner with those too, and they're super amazing. If you're looking for advice on how to plan your compliance and do really well in your compliance, then we do that. And there's lots of organizations out there that help you do that. If you think that you can handle all of that in-house, then yes, the auditor will typically have a readiness team that will help you. We'll give you advice and just take a peek at what you're doing and let you know if you're on the right track or not. So it depends. There's just lots of people out there to help. I'm sorry, there's no right answer. Talk to your auditor. Yeah.
One of the things I tend to find, though, is I think a lot of people kind of think it is just about advice. I mean, you know, there often are hidden costs associated with this as well, related to, you know, because when someone's coming in and advising what to do, and the timeline can be impacted by this as well, is that you may have to implement additional tools, right? You may have to implement a different process and procedures that can, you know, take time to buy, take time to implement, take time to record the information. You know, I guess I think that it's trying to understand the difference between people who have gone through this before and people who are going through a recurring process when they come to you. And if someone's gone through and they've been through high trust twice before and they're just changing assessors, they're more likely to be ready to go through it again than someone who's doing it for the first time.
Yes. Yeah. And yes, absolutely. So if you haven't survived an audit yet and you are gearing up to survive your first audit, first of all, it's a full-time job for at least a year. It doesn't matter what framework you pick. It's going to take you at least a year to get ready to form the relationships internally with the people who have to do the things that they don't want to do, and the people that you're going to have to get to give you screenshots of things that you don't have access to. So internally, it's a full-time job for at least a year for you. And then on top of that, you have, no matter what framework you pick, you have at least 75, if not 300 or 400 controls that you have to address one at a time, that you have to write explanations for, that you have to pull screenshots for. A lot of the time you're doing it in a spreadsheet, and if that spreadsheet doesn't save properly, or if you have a copy and paste mistake and you lose hundreds of hours of work. So there's just a lot involved. So there's absolutely organizations that can help you with that. Obviously, there's platforms and tools that can help you with that. But it's a lot. It's drinking from a fire hose, getting through your first audit for sure.
So as you know, we, Ostendio, we launched last month our audit guarantee program, right? Where we guarantee that anyone who kind of uses our services and our platform, that they'll pass their security audit first time. But we use the word pass, obviously, and it's a kind of interesting word, pass. It's not quite pass, is it? Right? There's a little bit more nuance involved in this. You know, audits are less binary than maybe people give the impression. Maybe can you allude to that a little bit? What does it mean to pass an audit in the kind of language that we use?
That depends entirely on the audit. So for SOC, usually we want your SOC report to have no critical findings in it. So we'll help you implement your program to make sure that you're addressing all of the controls to sufficient detail that the auditor won't have any critical findings. With high trust, it really is pass or fail. You either pass or you fail. But we'd also like you to have a limited number of corrective action plans too. We'd like it to be a good looking report. You know, FedRAMP, EDE, every program's a little bit different. The way that we define pass or fail is the report that's generated at the end something that's going to make your program acceptable to the people who are relying on your audit report?
Now, I know that SOC will always have findings, but I guess the question in SOC is whether you have a qualified report or an unqualified report. With a qualified report meaning that they've found findings that are serious enough for them to
critical. That's right.
not give you a full issue.
Yeah.
Really, so ironically, what you're really looking for, which I always found is quite interesting, is that, you know, the ideal with SOC 2 is that you want an unqualified report, and it always sounds like what you know, it's not qualified because no one's qualified to do it, but it means that they've not qualified, that they've not put any kind of controls.
That's right.
But high trust is a little bit more interesting, because I know you said it's a pass fail, but there's a scoring system involved in high trust. It's a little bit nuanced.
Yes. It's a week-long course to understand high trust scoring, so I'm not going to explain it in the 15 minutes we have, but yes, so you have to score at least 62 out of 75, so at least 80 some percent in order to pass high trust. But the way that you score it is it's a little bit complicated. We can definitely help explain that.
Now, well, this has been a growing area. We've talked a lot, you know, I talk a lot in some of my you know, previous webinars and some of the stuff we write about, which is how fast technology is changing, right? We're in this kind of cloud-based world where, you know, more and more people have data, more and more data in the cloud, and there's more kind of supply chain risk that we talked about. What we've seen with that is a corresponding requirement for organizations to require their vendors to go through these kind of external security audits. And that's actually seen an explosion in audit firms who are basically providing these types of audits. You know, I'm not sure that there's more high trust assessors than there has been in the last couple of years, but there's certainly more high trust assessments being conducted. And there's just a lot more SOC 2 auditors and audit firms and audits being conducted from your perspective. I guess, you know, I'm kind of leading to the question, how do you decide, or how do you choose with so many audit firms out there today? How do you choose the right audit firm? What would you put as a kind of criteria to make sure that you're actually operating or working with a credible audit firm?
I don't want to trash audit firms, because I think that running an audit firm is incredibly challenging, having just come from that world. But I would say that if you are trying to find an audit firm that fits you, pay attention to the questions that they ask you. So if they're out of the gate asking you questions that are going to help you define your scope so that it's manageable, that's a good group to work with, because they're going to help you be successful in a manageable way. They should be asking you why you're doing the framework that you're doing, and they should be giving you advice on how to keep it as small and manageable as possible, I would say. And obviously reputation. And if they're promising you that they're going to help you pass in the first conversation, then maybe.
What about price? I mean, there's a huge variation. I mean, we obviously have a number of audit partners ourselves, and we talk to a lot of audit firms out there. And it seems to me like you can negotiate a SOC audit from anything from about $10,000 up to, you know, $180,000, right? Is cost a barometer in any way?
Not really. I would say that's a little bit misleading. So there's definitely guardrails, like a SOC 2 shouldn't be costing you more than a couple $100,000. That's a lot of money. But anything that's less than $10,000, I would question the veracity of that audit. And I think that there are organizations out there who maybe don't have the best reputation that are doing really quick. I'm super uncomfortable talking about this. So I think that you get what you pay for. An organization that's costing a little bit more is probably spending a little bit more time helping you understand where you are, reporting back to you about progress, you know, doing a little bit extra uploading for you to make your life easier. So if you're paying a premium, you're probably getting something for that premium, but a SOC audit should be at least $25,000 to $35,000 because of the number of man hours required just to look at all of the controls and look at all of the evidence.
I think that's the way I've always looked at it, which is this concept of, you know, you sort of can probably get a term, you know, an idea of how much the hourly rate of someone who's gone through the qualification process of becoming an auditor, because it's not an easy path to go through. And if you've gone through AICPA certification, or if you've gone through high trust assessor certification, it's not a cheap process to get qualified to become an auditor. And therefore, when you think about what an auditor is typically paid from a salary perspective, etc., and then you translate. So, I look at it, if, and I've said this to people before, if someone's quoting you $10,000 to do a robust stock audit, and you try and translate it into, I don't know, say $200 an hour, even $150 an hour into the number of hours, it's probably not enough hours to just do the job efficiently. And so at that point, there's a kind of sanitization perspective of me that basically says to people, if there's a certain point that, there's a minimum level of work that needs to be conducted. And if the cost goes below what is reasonable for that, you've got to question whether or not they're actually doing the work properly or not. Now, the flip side to you mentioned there, I don't know that that's an excuse to then be charging way over the odds, right? Because again, there is only a certain amount of money. But I think you're right in terms of making sure that the interview process and asking them sort of good questions, and I think asking for references from other organizations they've audited. A good auditor is going to kind of give you their peer review report, and they're going to give you, that's another thing I think it's always a good idea to ask for the peer review report, but then ask them for references as well.
And also timeline, right? The faster you want it done, the more people they're going to have to put on it, so that will affect cost too.
We're almost out of time. We're coming to the end. A couple of questions, turn it back to you. So now, we started off with you and your background. Maybe tell people a little bit what you're doing now, because your last role when we first met, you were actually working for an audit firm. You were conducting the audits. You've now jumped back into the other side, into the original side you're at. You're now helping to prepare organizations today to get ready. From your perspective, what's the difference in terms of approach, and which one do you enjoy the most?
I definitely enjoy being on this side more, for sure. I don't know. You know what? There's something satisfying to finishing an audit and checking off all the boxes and knowing that at the end you have the right answer. So there's definitely something very satisfying to that. But what we do here is we help organizations get control of the thing that stresses them out the most, and that's satisfying for a very different reason. We're doing a bunch of different things. So the professional services team at Ostendio is growing. We're helping organizations just learn how to use the platform and manage their security program effectively. And that's just part of what we do for being good citizens as part of Ostendio. And then on top of that, we have this amazing team that sits down and will help you decide what your policies should be and help you decide how to deploy them and help you decide what tools and frameworks you should be looking at. So we provide training and education, and we help you decide how to roll out your own training and education awareness around security. So it's definitely more fun because we just get to help people every day now. So
when I first introduced the concept to you of conducting the security audit guarantee, I know that that was an interesting kind of conversation we had. But we kind of talked through it. You gradually became really comfortable with the idea because based on the way that we do this, your perspective was, well, there's no risk, right? Do you want to explain that a little bit? Why did you, for someone who's now responsible for preparing our customers to get ready for the audit program, for working with the auditors themselves, why did you suddenly become comfortable with, again, what is really the industry's first security audit guarantee program? How can we guarantee that customers are going to pass their audit?
So I have to say that on one hand, you did wear me down a little bit. So if you presented an audit guarantee to me as an auditor, I would have said no forever, right? Because as an auditor, it is again, like it breaks my integrity to guarantee that I'm going to pass you. So what made me feel more comfortable on this side is we're not promising that we're going to make the auditor do what we want them to do. That's not our job. We would never threaten their independence. So the auditors are always going to audit the way that they do. What we're doing that reduces the risk of failing an audit or having critical findings is we're helping you manage your program based on our experience passing audits and surviving audits and working with those auditors. So we have all of these amazing audit partners that we work with. We've learned their process. We've learned the order that they want the documents presented in. We've learned how they want the evidence to look. And we just sit down and help you present your evidence in a way that is clear and inarguable. And so that the auditor's job is just to make sure everything's true. whereas they do normally end up spending a lot of time just trying to get information from you. And what we're doing now is we're trying to really make the audit about verifying that all the controls are in place. So the risk is reduced because if we do our job properly, then all the evidence is there and before the audit starts.
And how does the MyVCM platform help with that process? How does that kind of help ensure that that information and evidence is there?
I mean, first of all, you are assessing yourself and your auditor is assessing you in the platform. So all of the controls are laid out one by one in detail. And then as you manage your security program, as you do your quarterly and annual reviews, and as you train your staff, and as you roll out your procedures and have people acknowledge that they've read them, all of that evidence is already there. There's no messy screenshots. You're just attaching the evidence to the control that made you go and set up that compliance review in the first place. So it's all encapsulated, it's all connected together. As things change in your program, or as your controls get more sophisticated because what you do as a company gets more complicated, you get to just update the way that you manage your program. And then the evidence is there for the auditor to look at. So it's pretty, you kind of get to move away from spreadsheets and copy and paste errors and just host your live data there. And then when the auditor wants a snapshot, you serve it up to them, you just link it.
Excellent. That's probably a perfect way to end our conversation or discussion. I mean, Gila, I have missed your daughters on this call. It would have been nice if we were on here, but I appreciate you filling the gap. Thank you for your time. I enjoy working with you every day. The kind of insight and the work ethic you bring to the organization. We're so delighted to have you on board and helping our customers. I know that they feel exactly the same way. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Yeah, back to you.
All right, thank you, Grant, and thank you, Gila, for sharing your expertise this morning. If the messages in the chat feature are any indication, looks like the messaging was received very well, so thank you. We do have a few questions, so you guys ready?
Fire away.
All right. First question is that a Scottish accent? That's the first question.
Gila, are you Scottish? If it directed me, presumably yes. It's from a town called Paisley, just outside Glasgow. But I've not lived there for a long time, so don't ask people from Paisley to recognise this accent because they would probably ask if I was American.
Wow. Okay. Great. Second question is, if other people in my industry are not interested in audits, should I still consider one? That could be to either of you.
I think so. I think having that independent perspective to tell you things that maybe you're blind to because you've been doing things the same way forever is valuable. It just gives you the freedom to pick one that's maybe less time consuming.
Yeah, I just added, really, based on the earlier conversation, it really depends where you are as an organization. I think that once you get to a certain size, I think your board will be interested to know independently. There's a temptation, I think, for organizations to kind of believe their own story, particularly IT-centric organizations. I mean, as I talked about earlier on, IT organizations and IT engineers particularly tend to put a real reliance on technology. And so having an independent verification and process and procedures there is useful. But it really is, it has to be at the point where you're in an organization where this becomes critical for you. If you're in an organization where having a breach, because, going back to the point we talked about earlier, why are you doing this? You're not doing it to be compliant, you're doing it to have a more effective security and risk management program. So, if I'm on a board for a somewhat medium to large organization, I want to know and have assurances. When I talk to a lot of the investors that we deal with, I encourage them all to ensure that their portfolio companies have gone through some form of SOC 2 because they want to be assured that the investment they're putting in these organizations. So I think there's lots of good reasons why an organization should do this once they're at that kind of stage where they can afford it.
Great. Yeah, this provides a great segue for our next question. And the next question is a bit long, so just bear with me for a second. And the question goes like this: as a CISO or CISO, what is the best way to combat misinformation inside of your organization around compliance? And he gives an example, like a sales guy keeps saying HIPAA compliant or using the zero trust in the wrong context, or even saying SOC 2 is pass, fail. Also combating the groups out there saying you can get compliant in 2 weeks.
Well, let me take that one first, and then I'll let Gila add, because as a former CISO, right, my challenge was always, how do I operationalize the security program? You know, it comes down to your primary objective, right? There's always going to be misinformation. You know, as I said, this predominance of HIPAA compliance per se has been in the industry for the longest period of time. But I think fundamentally you have to bring it back to first principles. What is my core objective as an organization? And the core objective as an organization is to improve my security posture, to ensure that I'm less likely to have some sort of security instance. And again, that comes into the concept of risk management. So really it's about focus on building an effective security program. Any effective security program is going to have an effective training program, recurring training and education as part of that process. And then I think if you can build that culture within your organization, and one of the things that we really try to do at Ostendio with the MyVCM platform is try and democratize the security process across every single person within the organization. Make sure every single person understands their contribution to the security process and to, you know, the security posture generally, rather than treating employees as almost like enemy combatants, right? You know, too many organizations think they're the most poorest part of the organization. If you basically recruit them and use them as your kind of frontline army and educate them in the process, then a lot of that misinformation is going to disappear.
Gila, do you have anything to add on to that?
Yeah, I agree with everything Grant said. I would, if you're struggling with that right now, I'm a big fan of just lunch and learns. Like, I have a bunch of slide decks. If you have a favorite framework, I'm happy to send you some of the slides that we use for that framework. But sometimes just sitting everybody down and buying them some sandwiches or some coffee and explaining to them what's involved in that particular framework and compliance with that framework, it goes a really long way. So sometimes it's hard to know what to tell them about the framework. So we can definitely help with that.
Okay, great. That is the, I mean, we're well past the top of the hour, so, and I'm getting a buzz to wrap it up. So we will answer your questions. Thank you everyone so much for joining this session today. We will be sending you a recording just as a reminder so you can share with other members of your organization. And if you do have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. You could reach us at ostendio.com. Thank you again, Gila and Grant, for sharing your expertise.